In the brutal winter of 1241, a panicked lord sent his scarred, outcast daughter to the slaughter. She was meant to be a decoy, a disposable lamb fed to a conquering werewolf king. But the moment the alpha breathed in her terrified scent, the entire continent's history violently changed. The chronicles of the 13th century rarely mention the Duchy of Oakhaven without noting its inevitable bloody downfall. Nestled in the fertile valleys beneath the jagged peaks of the Frostfang Mountains, Oakhaven was a prosperous, arrogant realm ruled by Lord Alden Harrington. For decades, the Harringtons had grown fat on the grain and silver of their lands, safely ignoring the ancient primeval forests to the north. But in the autumn of 1241, the North came for them. The Winterborn Pack, a massive army of lycanthrope warriors led by the ruthless Alpha King Kaelin, had swept through the neighboring territories like a plague of iron and claws. They were not mindless beasts, which made them infinitely more terrifying. They were highly disciplined, fiercely loyal, and possessed strength that made a mockery of Oakhaven's stone walls and steel-clad knights. With Kaelin's banners planted just 3 leagues from the city gates, Lord Alden sought a desperate parley. The resulting treaty, later known as the Concord of the Red Pines, demanded heavy tributes of grain, gold, and most cruelly, a bride. King Kaelin demanded Lord Alden's most prized possession to seal the blood pact, his famously beautiful daughter, Rosalind, to be taken as a bride and hostage. To the Harringtons, it was a death sentence. Rosalind, with her spun gold hair and flawless porcelain skin, was the jewel of the family, groomed to marry a southern prince, not a savage northern beast. When the terms were brought to the Great Hall, Rosalind collapsed into hysterics, tearing at her silk gowns and screaming that she would rather swallow poison than share a bed with a monster who transformed into a wolf under the full moon. Her mother, Lady Catherine, a woman whose political cunning was matched only by her profound cruelty, stroked her favored daughter's hair and shushed her cries. "You shall not go to the beasts, my sweet," Catherine whispered, her eyes darting toward the darkened corners of the hall. "We have another daughter, one whose life has already been ruined." Hidden in the shadows, scrubbing the ashes from the hearth, was Genevieve. Genevieve was the eldest Harrington daughter, though the family had spent the last 11 years pretending she did not exist. In the winter of 1230, a localized fire had swept through the nursery wing of the keep. While a nursemaid had saved Rosalind entirely, Genevieve had been trapped beneath a burning beam. The healers had saved her life, but the left side of her face and neck was left severely scarred, a jagged, melted landscape of raised pink and white flesh that pulled at the corner of her eye and ruined her noble prospects. In the superficial, unforgiving society of Oakhaven, a scarred woman was considered cursed, a physical manifestation of divine punishment. Genevieve was stripped of her titles in all but name, shoved into the servants' quarters, and treated as a shameful secret. She grew up isolated, finding solace only in the castle's massive library, educating herself in history, botany, and the ancient lore of the lycanthropes that her family so foolishly dismissed as mere bedtime stories. When Lord Alden and Lady Catherine descended upon her in the kitchens that evening, Genevieve knew her fate was sealed before they even spoke. "You will wear your sister's deepest veil," Lord Alden commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and forced authority. "You will wear her heavy winter cloak, and you will ride to the Winterborn camp. You will present yourself as Rosalind." Genevieve stared at the man who had sired her, her good eye reflecting the flickering firelight. "Father, the Alpha King is not a fool. When he lifts the veil and sees my face, he will know you have broken the treaty. He will realize you sent him your cast-off instead of your prize. By the time he lifts the veil, you will be in his tent, and we will be halfway to the southern ports," Lady Catherine snapped, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "The beast will likely kill you in his rage. It is a sacrifice you owe this family for the food you have stolen from our tables all these years. If you refuse, I will have the guards throw you into the dungeons to starve." It was not loyalty to her cruel family that made Genevieve agree, but a grim, hollow acceptance of her own worthlessness. She had read the texts of the Northern Pacts. She knew that lycanthropes valued honor above all else. Perhaps, she thought, she could reason with the king. Perhaps she could offer her own life in exchange for the innocent small folk of Oakhaven, who would surely be slaughtered when her father's cowardly deception was discovered. That night, Genevieve was violently scrubbed, perfumed, and forced into a breathtaking gown of midnight blue velvet, heavily embroidered with silver thread. A thick, opaque mourning veil was pinned securely to her hair, completely obscuring her features. She looked like a ghost, a beautiful, faceless phantom being sent to the underworld. Escorted by a terrified contingent of 4 Oakhaven knights, led by the perpetually sweating Sir Reginald, Genevieve rode out into the freezing night. The wind howled through the barren trees, carrying with it the undeniable scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and wet fur. As the massive war camp of the Winterborn pack came into view, sprawling across the valley like a city of leather and steel, Genevieve's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was riding to her execution, draped in her sister's stolen identity. The Winterborn encampment was unlike anything the chroniclers of the South had ever documented. There were no chaotic, drunken brawls, no disorganized rabble of mercenaries. As Genevieve's horse was led through the perimeter, she observed a terrifyingly disciplined military machine. Massive bonfires illuminated the faces of men and women who stood nearly 7 feet tall, their bodies corded with unnatural muscle, their eyes glowing with an eerie, reflective luminescence in the dark. These were the Lycans in their human forms, predators possessing a lethal grace that made the Oakhaven Knights look like stumbling toddlers. Sir Reginald's hands shook so violently that his armor rattled. When a towering Winterborn lieutenant, his face painted in blue woad, stepped forward and seized the reins of Genevieve's horse, the Oakhaven Knights practically whimpered. "The tribute is brought," Sir Reginald squeaked, his voice cracking. "The Lady Rosalind Harrington," as agreed in the Concord. The Lycan lieutenant merely grunted, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of the Oakhaven men. He ignored them entirely, turning his piercing yellow eyes to the veiled figure on the horse. "Dismount," he growled, his voice like grinding stones. "The Alpha King waits in the command pavilion." Genevieve slid from the saddle, her velvet skirts heavy with the winter dampness. She kept her chin high beneath the veil. If she was to die tonight, she would not give her father the satisfaction of dying a coward. She was led through the maze of tents, the oppressive, heavy scent of alpha predators pressing in on her from all sides. The command pavilion was a massive structure of black canvas and direwolf pelts, situated at the very center of the camp. As the flaps were pulled back, Genevieve stepped into a stiflingly warm space illuminated by dozens of thick tallow candles. Standing over a sprawling map table in the center of the room was Kaelin, the Alpha King of the Winterborn. The breath left Genevieve's lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The histories had described him as a monster, but the reality was far more complicated. Kaelin was colossal, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, dressed in dark leather armor that looked battered from years of endless warfare. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, falling past his shoulders, framing a face that was brutally handsome, though marred by 3 jagged, silvery claw scars that ran diagonally across his jaw. But it was his eyes that paralyzed her. They were a piercing, glacial blue, radiating an ancient, dominant power that forced the air out of the room. Kaelin did not look up from his maps immediately. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the soles of Genevieve's boots. The lieutenant bowed and exited, dropping the heavy tent flap behind him. They were entirely alone. Genevieve stood frozen, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles ached. She waited for him to speak, to demand she remove the veil, to realize the insult her family had dealt him. Kaelin finally pushed himself away from the table. He took a single step toward her, and then, inexplicably, he froze. In werewolf biology, a subject utterly misunderstood by human scholars, the fated mate bond is not a romantic fairy tale. It is a violent, instantaneous chemical and spiritual collision. It is a biological imperative, a sudden, overwhelming rewriting of a Lycan's very DNA. Kaelin's glacial eyes widened slightly. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding against his leather armor. The scent hit him like a physical blow. It was not the cloying, superficial rosewater perfume that Lord Alden's people had bathed her in. Beneath that artificial stench was a scent that Kaelin's soul recognized instantly. Ancient parchment, dried lavender, and rain-soaked earth. It was a scent that instantly silenced the raging, violent wolf residing within his mind. The Alpha King, the most feared warlord on the continent, visibly trembled. Genevieve took a panicked step backward. Was he transforming? Was he preparing to strike? In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, Kaelin crossed the room. He didn't draw a weapon. Instead, his large, calloused hands reached up, his fingers trembling with an uncharacteristic fragility as they found the edge of her heavy mourning veil. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the disgust, the rage, the inevitable strike of his claws when he saw her ruined face. With a soft rustle, Kaelin pulled the veil away and let it drop to the dirt floor. Genevieve stood trembling, the left side of her face fully exposed to the harsh candlelight. The jagged, melted skin of her burn scar was stark and undeniable. She waited for the scream of fury. She waited for death. Instead, a profound, heavy silence filled the pavilion. Slowly, Genevieve opened her good eye. Kaelin was not looking at her with revulsion. He was staring at her with a look of absolute, breathless reverence, as if he had just unearthed the most precious, fragile artifact in existence. His glowing blue eyes traced the line of her scar, not with disgust, but with a sudden, localized fury not at her, but at whatever had caused her pain. Slowly, Kaelin fell to one knee. The Alpha King, a man who bowed to no god and no emperor, knelt in the dirt before her. He reached out, his thumb gently, impossibly softly, brushing the edge of her scarred cheek. "My queen," Kaelin breathed, his voice thick with a raw, primal emotion that sent a shiver down her spine. "My mate." Genevieve stared at him, utterly bewildered. "You do not understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I am not Rosalind. I am the outcast. I am the trick. My father sent me to die." At the mention of her father, the tender reverence in Kaelin's eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a storm of pure, unadulterated lichen wrath. A low, terrifying growl built in his chest, vibrating through the ground. He stood up, towering over her, his eyes flashing from glacial blue to a predatory, glowing amber. Kaelin's intellect was as sharp as his claws. The pieces fell into place in a fraction of a second. The Harringtons had thought so little of his fated mate that they had sent her as a disposable decoy. They had treated his queen as trash. Kaelin turned his head toward the entrance of the tent and let out a deafening, earth-shattering roar that silenced the entire camp. Within seconds, his generals rushed into the pavilion, their weapons drawn, expecting an assassin. Instead, they found their king standing possessively in front of a scarred human woman. "Sound the horns," Kaelin commanded, his voice echoing with lethal, murderous intent. "Break the camp. We march on Oakhaven tonight. The Lord Alden Harrington has insulted the Winterborn pack, and he has insulted your queen. By dawn, I want his city burned to the ground, and I want his head on a spike." The Frostfang Mountains had never witnessed a mobilization of such terrifying speed. The Winterborn pack did not march like a human army, weighed down by cumbersome supply trains and the slow, heavy trudge of weary foot soldiers. They moved like a localized hurricane, a relentless tide of muscle, steel, and synchronized fury. At the center of this storm rode Genevieve, wrapped securely in a massive, fur-lined cloak that Kaelin had draped over her trembling shoulders. She sat astride a colossal black destrier, riding entirely protected within the innermost circle of the Alpha's personal guard, flanked by towering warriors who now looked upon her not as a human prisoner, but as a sacred relic to be defended to the death. Kaelin rode beside her, his jaw set in a rigid line of barely contained violence. The glacial blue of his eyes had permanently shifted to a burning, predatory amber in the darkness. He barely spoke during the rapid descent through the valleys, his focus entirely consumed by the tactical execution of his vengeance. Yet, every few minutes, his massive hand would reach out across the space between their mounts, his leather-clad fingers gently brushing the reins near her hand, a silent, grounding reassurance that she was safe. It was a staggering juxtaposition. The most lethal warlord of the 13th century offering tender comfort to the girl Oakhaven had deemed utterly worthless. The Harrington family's cowardly escape plan had relied heavily on the assumption that a werewolf army would be slow to organize a pursuit. It was a fatal miscalculation born of southern arrogance. By the time Lord Alden's heavily laden carriages, stuffed with gold, tapestries, and stolen treasury silver, reached the winding mud roads of the southern pass, the Winterborn outriders were already waiting. Led by Kaelin's ruthless vanguard captain, Cedric, a pack of fully shifted lichens descended upon the fleeing convoy. There was no battle. It was an absolute submission. The Harrington guards threw down their swords the moment the massive, 8-foot-tall direwolves emerged from the tree line, their teeth bared in the moonlight. The carriages were forcibly turned around and escorted back to the gates of Oakhaven, arriving just as Kaelin's main host breached the city's outer walls. The siege of Oakhaven lasted less than an hour. The city garrison, terrified by the deafening howls echoing off the stone walls and the sheer, unnatural strength of the northern warriors who shattered the heavy oak gates with battering rams, surrendered without shedding a drop of blood. Kaelin had issued a strict command. No harm was to come to the innocent small folk. His wrath was reserved solely for the nobility who had dared to insult his mate. When Genevieve rode into the main courtyard of the keep she had spent her life scrubbing, the scene was one of utter humiliation for her bloodline. Lord Alden, Lady Catherine, and the supposedly flawless Rosalind had been dragged from their opulent carriages and forced to their knees in the muddy snow before the main steps of the Great Hall. They were surrounded by a ring of heavily armed, fiercely growling lichen soldiers. As Kaelin dismounted and approached the prisoners, the air grew thick with a suffocating, oppressive dominance. Lord Alden, sweating profusely despite the freezing air, began to grovel instantly. "Mercy, great king," Alden wept, pressing his forehead to the mud. "I beg of you, show mercy. I know the deception was an insult, the scarred creature. We only meant to spare our true prize for a proper ceremony. I have the real Rosalind here. Take her. Take my beautiful daughter. She is untouched, perfection itself. Just spare our lives." Rosalind, shivering in a thin silk traveling gown, looked up at Kaelin through tear-soaked eyelashes, attempting to look tragic and alluring. She had always been taught that her beauty could conquer any man, even a monster. But as Kaelin stepped closer, his upper lip curled in profound disgust. To his highly heightened senses, Rosalind smelled of overwhelming vanity, sour cowardice, and cheap, cloying perfumes. "You offer me this?" Kaelin's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that caused the stone beneath their feet to vibrate. He did not look at Rosalind with lust. He looked at her as one might look at a venomous snake. "You offer me a spoiled, treacherous child who would flee while her people were left to slaughter." "She is the jewel of Oakhaven!" Lady Catherine shrieked, her aristocratic composure entirely shattered. "The other is a monster, a scarred, useless freak. We only gave you what we intended to throw to the dogs." A collective, deafening snarl erupted from the surrounding Winterborn warriors. The sheer malice in Catherine's voice when speaking of their newly discovered queen sent a ripple of violent, protective rage through the pack. Kaelin raised a single hand, and the courtyard fell dead silent. He turned his back on the cowering family and walked to Genevieve's horse. Reaching up, he placed his hands on her waist and effortlessly lifted her down from the saddle. The heavy mourning veil was gone, her face completely uncovered in the light of the courtyard torches. He took her hand, lacing his large fingers through hers, and led her back to where her family knelt in the mud. "You are a fool, Alden Harrington," Kaelin stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity across the silent courtyard. "You lived your entire life blind to the only true treasure your decaying house possessed. You sent her into the dark, hoping the wolves would tear her apart. But the wolves recognize what you could not." Kaelin knelt smoothly, pressing a deep, reverent kiss to the scarred side of Genevieve's hand, never breaking eye contact with Lord Alden. "You did not send me a decoy," the Alpha King snarled, his amber eyes blazing. "You delivered me my fated mate. You delivered me the Queen of the North." The shock that washed over the faces of the Harrington family was absolute. Rosalind's jaw dropped in uncomprehending horror, her gaze darting between the monstrously handsome king and the sister she had spent a decade tormenting. Lady Catherine let out a strangled, breathless gasp, all the color draining from her face as the horrific reality of their situation finally settled in. They had not just insulted a warlord, they had abused, starved, and discarded the one woman who now held absolute power over their lives and deaths. Dawn broke over a fundamentally altered Oakhaven. The banners of the Harrington house, which had flown for 3 centuries, were torn from the battlements and replaced by the stark, terrifying sigil of the Winterborn pack, a silver direwolf against a midnight field. But the bloodbath that the Southern chroniclers had predicted never came to pass. Inside the Great Hall, Genevieve sat upon her father's heavy oak throne. Kaelin stood immediately behind her right shoulder, a towering, fiercely protective shadow, his hand resting gently on the back of her chair. The surviving nobility of the surrounding valleys had been brought in to swear fealty, and they watched in stunned silence as the scarred, outcast daughter dispensed a brand of justice they had never witnessed in Oakhaven. Genevieve possessed no desire for senseless slaughter. The years spent scrubbing floors and eating kitchen scraps had not made her cruel. They had made her intensely empathetic to the plight of the common folk. She immediately decreed that the oppressive grain taxes her father had levied upon the farmers were to be abolished. The granaries, hoarded for the nobility, were opened to feed the starving poor before the deep winter set in. When it came time to pass judgment on her own family, the Great Hall held its collective breath. Lord Alden, Lady Catherine, and Rosalind stood bound in chains at the center of the room, looking pathetic and hollow. Kaelin leaned down, his lips brushing Genevieve's ear. "Say the word, my mate," he whispered, his voice dark and promising. "Say the word, and I will paint this hall with their blood. No one harms you and lives." Genevieve looked at the family who had treated her as a cursed infection. She saw her father's cowardly weeping, her mother's venomous, defeated glare, and Rosalind's pathetic whimpering. Death would be too quick. Death would make them martyrs in the eyes of the Southern lords. "The Harringtons are stripped of all titles, lands, and wealth." Genevieve's voice echoed through the hall, steady and unyielding. She did not raise her voice, yet it carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "They shall not be executed. Instead, they shall understand the exact life they forced upon me. Alden, Catherine, and Rosalind will be remanded to the lowest levels of the servants' quarters. They will scrub the hearths, they will clean the stables, and they will eat what is left over when the garrison has finished. If they refuse to work, they will not eat. If they attempt to flee, the border patrols will show them no mercy." The poetic justice of the sentence sent a murmur of awe through the gathered crowd. Rosalind collapsed in a dead faint, while Lady Catherine began to scream hysterically until Kaylin's guards gagged her and dragged the three of them away to the soot-stained kitchens. In the weeks that followed, Oakhaven transformed from a place of vanity and cruelty into a heavily fortified, prosperous stronghold of the North. The Winterborn Pack did not conquer the city, they integrated with it. The human citizens, initially terrified of the giant lichen warriors, soon realized that these beasts were fiercely honorable. Crime plummeted to non-existence, for no thief dared steal when the city guards could track a scent for miles in the dark. For Genevieve, the transition from outcast to queen was a dizzying ascent, anchored entirely by Kaylin's unwavering devotion. In the privacy of their chambers, the ruthless warlord melted into a tender, deeply affectionate partner. He worshipped her entirely. He spent hours teaching her the complex, ancient history of his people, listening with rapt attention as she corrected his southern maps with her vast, self-taught geographical knowledge. Most profoundly, Kaylin completely altered how Genevieve viewed herself. For 11 years, she had been told her scarred face was a monstrosity, a punishment from the heavens. But in lichen culture, scars were not deformities. They were the highest marks of honor. They were proof of survival, resilience, and strength. One evening, as they sat before a roaring fire in the royal chambers, Kaylin gently traced the jagged edges of her burn scar with his fingertips. "The women of the South paint their faces with lead and powder to hide their weaknesses," he murmured, his amber eyes glowing with profound adoration. "But you wear your survival for the world to see. You looked death in the eye as a child, and you lived. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." For the first time in her life, Genevieve did not flinch away or try to hide her face in the shadows. She leaned into his touch, feeling a lifetime of shame and self-hatred finally break apart and dissolve into the firelight. She was no longer the ugly sister. She was Genevieve of the Winterborn, the fated mate of the Alpha King, a woman who had taken the ashes of a ruined life and forged an empire of snow and steel. And as the winter winds howled outside the thick glass windows, Genevieve knew that for the first time in her existence, she was exactly where she was meant to be. What did you think of Genevieve's ultimate revenge and her incredible rise from ashes to royalty? Did Lord Alden and Lady Catherine get the punishment they truly deserved? Or should Kaylin have unleashed his full lichen fury? Let us know your thoughts on this epic tale of fated mates and poetic justice in the comments below. If you loved this medieval werewolf drama, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, twisting stories.